Yo, what is going on, Favs Nation? It's your guy Fave, and I need you to lock in right now because Ben Johnson just did something head coaches almost never do. He stood in front of a room full of reporters at rookie minicamp and gushed, and I mean gushed, over a player who didn't get drafted. Not a first-round pick, not a big name, a tight end who went from a tiny NAIA program nobody's ever heard of all the way to a phone call from an NFL head coach before the draft even happened. His name is Hayden Large, and if you're a Bears fan and you haven't heard that name yet, buckle up because Ben Johnson is out here talking about this guy like he just found buried treasure in his own backyard. And honestly, the more you dig into this story, the more it feels like exactly that. Let's start with the actual quote because this is the piece of the story that got everybody's attention in the first place. Johnson told reporters that Hayden Large was a guy the Bears identified well before the draft, a player his staff genuinely liked. And then he told a story that honestly should give Bears fans chills if you care at all about culture and character on a roster. Johnson said he personally called Large before the draft to let him know Chicago had a vision for him. That alone is rare. Head coaches don't usually pick up the phone themselves for guys who might not even get drafted. That's normally a job for area scouts, position coaches, guys further down the totem pole. But Johnson made that call himself. And when the Bears turned around and used the third-round pick on another tight end anyway, a guy named Sam Roush out of Stanford, Johnson figured that was it. He figured Large would bolt for a team with a clearer path to playing time. Instead, according to Johnson, Large didn't blink. He stayed committed to Chicago regardless of how crowded that room had just gotten. Johnson's exact words were that it speaks volumes about how the kid is wired, and Fave's personal opinion, I don't think that's just a coach being nice for a press conference. When a head coach fresh off a return to the postseason takes time out of rookie minicamp to specifically single out a guy who didn't hear his name called on draft weekend, that is not filler content. That is a coach telling you, pay attention, this dude might actually matter. So who is Hayden Large and why did an NFL coaching staff fall for him this hard? This is where the story gets genuinely wild because his path here is not normal. And honestly, it's the kind of background you almost never see attached to a player who's got an NFL head coach this excited. Large didn't come up through some blue blood high school program getting recruited by everybody in the country. He started his college career at Dordt, a small NAIA school, where he played as a tight end and fullback hybrid. And get this, according to reporting on his college career, Large actually put up real receiving production at that level, something like 62 catches for 950 yards and 12 touchdowns across his 3 seasons there. That's legitimately productive tight end play at that level of competition. The kind of number that should have gotten more schools calling, but for whatever reason, it took a while for the bigger programs to notice him. From Dordt, he transferred all the way up to the Big Ten, landing at the University of Iowa, a program that has an absolutely ridiculous track record of churning out tight ends who go on to have real NFL careers. We're talking George Kittle, who turned into an all-pro monster in San Francisco. We're talking TJ Hawkinson, a first-round pick who's been a Pro Bowl caliber player. We're talking Sam Laporta, who Ben Johnson himself helped turn into a superstar back when Johnson was calling plays in Detroit, watching Laporta explode as a rookie with production that instantly made him one of the best young tight ends in the league. Iowa does not miss at this position, and that lineage matters here because it's part of exactly why Johnson is this excited. When you've already proven you can take a modestly productive Iowa tight end and turn him into a star, and then another undrafted profile Iowa tight end lands in your lap, of course you're going to be intrigued. Now here's the twist, because if you go look up Large's actual receiving stats at Iowa, you are going to be underwhelmed if all you care about are box scores. This is a guy who across his time at Iowa finished with something in the range of 14 career catches for well under 100 yards with 0 touchdowns. 14 catches across multiple seasons of college football at the Big Ten level. On paper, that looks like a guy who barely got on the field, maybe a special teams body, maybe a camp arm you cut in August without a second thought. But Fave's personal opinion right here, and this is important, don't let that stat line fool you, because Large spent a chunk of his time at Iowa lined up as a fullback in an offense that leaned heavily into physical downhill football. His job was never to rack up catches. His job was to move bodies off the ball and clear running lanes for Iowa's rushing attack. And by every account out of that program, he did that at an elite level. In fact, according to Pro Football Focus grading, Large finished with a run block grade of 72.4, which ranked 23rd among 432 qualified tight ends in all of college football last season. 23rd out of over 400 tight ends nationally. That is not a fluke. That is a legitimately dominant blocker at the position, and that's the exact trait that made Iowa's staff and eventually Ben Johnson fall in love with him. When you hear people around that program describe him, the words that keep coming up are heart and soul, the kind of description you reserve for a guy whose value to a team goes so far beyond anything that shows up on a stat sheet. And that brings us to the part of this story where the football makes total sense, because you have to understand what kind of offense Ben Johnson actually wants to run in Chicago. This man has an obsession with tight ends. It is not even a secret around the league at this point. Coaches and analysts talk about it constantly. The Bears deployed multiple tight end personnel groupings with the league calls 12 and 13 personnel at some of the highest rates in all of football last season. According to reporting, Chicago ran 13 personnel at the fourth highest rate in the NFL and 12 personnel at the sixth highest rate. That means 2, sometimes 3 tight ends on the field at the same time, creating absolute nightmares for opposing defensive coordinators who have no idea if they're about to get run over or thrown over. And this isn't some brand new philosophy Johnson just discovered in Chicago either. This is exactly the identity he built in Detroit, leaning on multiple tight end sets to create matchup problems, forcing defenses to declare whether they're treating those groupings as run support or genuine downfield threats. The whole league is trending in this direction right now too, because defenses have started using these hybrid safeties. Guys fast enough to cover a slot receiver, but big enough to blitz off the edge or fill a run gap like a linebacker. The counter to that trend is exactly what Johnson is building. Big, athletic tight ends who neutralize that hybrid safety's advantage simply by being too big to cover and too fast to ignore. And instead of putting just one of those matchup nightmares on the field, Johnson wants 2 or 3 of them out there simultaneously. So even in a room that already looks stacked, adding a legit physical blocker like Large isn't a luxury pickup. It's a schematic necessity for the kind of football Johnson wants to play, and every extra body who can hold that role at a high level makes the entire offense harder to defend on any given Sunday. Let's talk about that room, though, because context is everything, and this is genuinely one of the deepest, most talented tight end groups in the entire NFL right now. At the top, you've got Colston Loveland, the electrifying first-round pick who broke out in his rookie season and is already being talked about as one of the most exciting young tight ends in the entire league. A guy who looks like a true focal point of this passing offense for years to come. Then you've got Cole Kmet, the steady, dependable veteran who has been a fixture in Chicago for years, a trusted target who put up 33 catches for 378 yards and 3 touchdowns last season alone, and who has built real chemistry with this quarterback room over multiple seasons in the league. And this offseason, the Bears added even more firepower, using a third-round pick on Sam Roush out of Stanford, another big athletic tight end who profiles as an elite blocker in his own right, exactly the kind of prospect built for Johnson's scheme. So you've got a rookie phenom, a proven veteran, and a fresh high draft investment, all locked into that room before Hayden Large's name even enters the conversation. Fave's personal opinion, that's not a depth chart, that's a logjam, and it's exactly why Large, going out of his way to sign with Chicago anyway, says something real about him. He had options. Undrafted free agents get to pick their spot. They can shop around the league in the frantic hours right after the draft ends. And plenty of teams around the NFL would have offered him a clearer runway to actual playing time. He looked at the most crowded tight end room in football and ran toward it anyway. That's not the move of a guy looking for an easy handout. That's a competitor who wants to prove he belongs regardless of the names already in front of him. And honestly, that kind of mentality is exactly what gets a coaching staff talking about you in glowing terms before you've even played a preseason snap. Now, because we keep it real on this channel, let's talk about the part of this story that isn't all sunshine, because making this roster is going to be a genuine grind for Hayden Large. Teams typically only keep 3 to 4 tight ends on their initial 53-man roster, and with Loveland, Kmet, and Roush already penciled in as near locks, Large is realistically fighting for one open spot, if that spot even exists once final cuts roll around in late August. The math is not friendly here, and it would be dishonest of me to sit here and act like this is a guaranteed outcome, because it isn't. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is where speculation, and I want to be clear, this next part is speculation, not confirmed fact, starts to matter. There has been real chatter this offseason about Cole Kmet's long-term future in Chicago. According to Bleacher Report's trade block reporting, Kmet has been floated as a trade candidate, with teams like Kansas City and Carolina mentioned as potential suitors for a proven pass-catching tight end, teams looking for that steady veteran presence at a position where continuity matters. Now, the Bears reportedly aren't in a rush to move him, especially after restructuring his contract to fit his current role on this roster, which suggests Chicago still values what he brings even in a crowded room. But if that speculation ever does turn into an actual trade, whether it's to Kansas City, Carolina, or somewhere else entirely, the door for a player like Large to carve out a real role on this roster swings open a whole lot wider than it looks right now. And even without any roster shakeup at all, special teams value combined with dominant blocking reps in training camp and preseason games could be exactly what convinces this coaching staff to find him a spot, regardless of how crowded that position group looks on paper heading into final cuts. There's already buzz building around exactly that scenario. According to Bears insider coverage out of training camp circles, Large has been named a legitimate sleeper candidate to make the 53-man roster, with one insider specifically pointing out that if the Bears are going to lean this heavily into multiple tight end sets, having a fourth tight end who can also line up in the backfield like a fullback makes complete sense. And that's a real detail worth sitting with. Fave's personal opinion, the Bears haven't used a true fullback on this roster in years, not since Kari Blasingame got cut a couple seasons back. Johnson has used fullbacks before in his career too, back in Detroit, before eventually shifting that role over to backup tight ends instead. If Johnson brings that role back specifically to keep a player like Large on the field, that tells you this coaching staff sees something more versatile in him than just camp filler, something that fits a very specific vision for how this offense wants to attack opposing defenses on early downs. He can play special teams too, according to reporting out of camp, which in the modern NFL is often the exact difference maker that separates a guy who makes the initial 53 from a guy who gets stashed on the practice squad and hopes for a call-up later in the season when injuries inevitably start piling up. Let's zoom out for a second, because I think the human element of this story is honestly what makes it worth talking about on this channel in the first place. This is a kid who started at a tiny NAIA school most casual football fans have never heard of, grinding it out against a level of competition that almost never produces NFL talent. He walked on at Iowa, had to fight his way into snaps in a major Big Ten program that already had established players ahead of him, switched between fullback and tight end depending on what the offense needed from him at any given moment, and by every account out of that building became a genuine leader in that locker room despite not putting up gaudy stats. According to teammates, he wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but people rallied around him and followed his lead anyway, which is a specific kind of respect that doesn't get earned through talk. It gets earned through work, through showing up early, through doing the unglamorous jobs on the field that never show up on a highlight reel, but win football games anyway. And now here he is, getting a personal recruiting call from an NFL head coach before the draft, getting praised publicly for his character before he's played a single competitive snap in this league. Fave's personal opinion, and I'll die on this hill, stories like this are exactly why training camp is must-watch television every single year. Everybody already knows what the first-round picks and the established vets are going to bring to the table. It's the long shots, the guys who took the hard, weird, non-traditional road just to get a shot, who end up being the most compelling storylines of the entire summer, and Hayden Large might be the best version of that story in this entire rookie class. So where does this actually go from here for Hayden Large? Realistically, his path to making this roster runs through two things. First, he needs to keep flashing that elite blocking ability in padded practices and preseason reps, the exact trait that got Ben Johnson excited about him in the first place, the thing that separates him from every other camp body fighting for a roster spot this summer. Second, he needs the Bears front office to either open up a roster spot through a trade, whether that's Kmet or someone else entirely, or he needs the coaching staff to decide the value of a fullback tight end hybrid on special teams is worth carrying a fourth body at the position heading into the regular season. Neither of those is guaranteed, and anybody telling you this is a lock is selling you something. But according to everything coming out of Hollis Hall right now, from the head coach's own glowing praise to insider chatter naming him a legitimate sleeper candidate, Hayden Large has put himself in a real conversation, which is honestly more than most undrafted free agents can say heading into the summer grind of training camp. That's the story. Faves Nation. An undrafted kid from a program most people couldn't find on a map, who worked his way up through Iowa's tight end factory, who got personally recruited by his own head coach before the draft even started, and who chose the hardest possible path into one of the most stacked tight end rooms in the entire NFL just because that's exactly where he wanted to be. This is a rookie class full of hype and big-name storylines all over this Bears roster, but Hayden Large might end up being one of the most fascinating threads to pull on all summer long, precisely because nobody outside of Iowa and Chicago was talking about him until a head coach decided to change that with one press conference. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Hayden Large actually makes this 53-man roster, or is that tight end room simply too deep for an undrafted rookie to crack no matter how much praise he's getting right now? And if you were running this front office, would you actually pull the trigger on trading Cole Kmet to clear a path for the young guys behind him? Drop it all in the comments. I read every single one. If this is your first time here, do not walk away without hitting that subscribe button, because Favs brings you the real, no-filter breakdown of everything happening across this league, breaking news, rumors, and analysis every single week. Smash that like button if this kept you locked in from start to finish. Tag a Bears fan who needs to see this story, and I will see you in the next one. This has been Fave, signing off. Faves out.